This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, you're all my witnesses. I recorded. Okay, going to do a little bit of redundancy or repetition, I guess would be a better word from last week. Um, Let me get everything caught up. Okay, I had given a list of the last kings or the kings of Judah, uh, and the bad by far outweigh the good ones. And we're down here to the last. Um, there's Hezekiah, and I think that's where I stopped. But following Hezekiah, if you'll notice, Hezekiah is right here, far right, during the final captivity of Assyria. This is where this is kind of where we are. And while this is going on, Isaiah and Micah are the two prophets. And one of the things, and I'm not going to get into this a whole lot today, but one of the things that kind of intrigued me a little bit was that apparently Hezekiah and Isaiah were friends. And you don't see that much with a prophet and a king. Certainly not in the north. In the north, the prophets and the kings didn't get along very well. But in the south, they did to the most part. But Isaiah and Hezekiah conversed quite a bit, and like I say, that's not necessarily what today's Bible study is going to be about. And actually, I hope this works out. I've got my style. I do my style. I can't do somebody else's style. Somebody else can't do my style, and so on. So I like to just go down the scriptures and talk about what the scriptures say and some other things. And I know, some people may or may not like that, but that's just me. I can't do anything about it. Uh, so I had this great idea today or last couple of weeks to combine three different events and try to come up with some interesting points about them. Well, I will speak about the three different events today, but my points kind of fell a little on the weak side, so we won't worry about the points. Maybe you all can figure out the points yourselves. So, in talking to Mark, I don't know if it was last week or week before last, we were talking about how a little strange it is that we had horrible king, great king, horrible king. Bang, bang, bang. And he felt like maybe that's a direction that I ought to kind of go in today, and I'm going to try to go in that direction a little bit. But I got to thinking about it, and this happens in all walks of life. It happens today. There are good parents who have children who are in prison. We've had horrible parents who have really good children that grew up to be great men and so on. So this is not what was happening in Judah is not something that isn't still happening today. I have friends who are in that exact situation. And I'm sure some of you all, if not all of you all, have friends who or people who either had good parents, bad kids, bad parents, good kids, or so on. I can think of two families right now that the parents were good, and two of the kids are in one child in each of the two families is in prison for life, one for murder. And, it just, I don't know, circumstances, friends that they had, or maybe in the case of the two examples that we're going to have today, I personally believe we had two very good mothers. I don't think the fathers were very good, but I think the mothers trained their sons to be good, and I call them Christians. I know this is in the Old Testament, but trained them to be good men, to be believers in Yahweh and followers. So um, here's one of we're just going to jump right in and start with um, one of the terrible kings, and this is the father of Hezekiah, Ahaz, King Ahaz. King Ahaz was one of the sorriest kings that Judah ever had, and he was probably as bad as some of the ones in the north, maybe as bad as Ahab and so on. But Ahaz gathered together the vessels of the house of God and cut in pieces the vessels of the house of God. I just can't wrap my hands around that. I'm sorry. I just can't see how you could hate God so much that you would go into the temple and go into the holy place. It doesn't say anything about the most holy, but go into the holy place and cut them in pieces. And then he shut the doors and locked the doors of the temple. And then it says he went out and he made altars in every corner of Jerusalem. And in verse 25, it says, and in several cities of Judah, he made high places to burn incense to other gods. And guess what? It provoked to anger Yahweh Elohim of his fathers. Well, of course it did. And note that among the other acts of evil that he did, Ahaz shut the doors of the temple, just locked it up, and basically put the priests and the Levites out of a job. Now, there were other things that they could do, but they could not work in the temple anymore. And then out of the clear blue sky, now it came to pass in the third year of Hosea. Remember, Hosea was the last king of the north, that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, began to reign, and he was 25 years old. Now, his dad wouldn't have taught him anything about God, so somebody did. So I'm going to give credit to his mother, and I presume to some Levites and some of the priests, but certainly you would have to you would think that you could give credit to his mother because she's named here. And by the way, the next one that we're going to talk about, the next good king, his mother's name was named also. And I think personally, going out on a limb here, but I believe that these mothers had a great deal to do with why their sons turned out to be good kings. But his mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah, and I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. That's not the prophet. This is a different Zechariah. But anyway, he did what was right in the sight of Yahweh, according to all that his father David had done. So, occasionally when we read about a king's mother being mentioned, it's because she was a good mother. And that's where I'm going with this one, and I won't say anything else about it. That's just my opinion. In verse 5, it says that Hezekiah trusted in Yahweh Elohim of Israel. So, and then the writer of Kings says here very plainly that Hezekiah was the best king that Judah ever had. Well, the writers of Kings and Chronicles say the same thing about Hezekiah, about Josiah, that we'll get to a little bit later. In each case, they were both really good kings, as good or better than any before him. And verse 6 says that he stuck with Yahweh. He didn't depart from following him. He kept his commandments, which Yahweh commanded Moses. Okay. So as we discussed last time, Hezekiah was one of, if not the best kings of all. And so here's some of the things that he did. In his first year, and remember he was what, 25 years old? Yeah, he was 25 years old. That's pretty young, to be a king. So in his 25th year, his first year of his reign, in the first month, now we're talking about the first month of the Hebrew calendar, the Jewish calendar, or God's calendar, whatever, however you want to put it, he reversed or began to reverse the things that his evil father had done. He opened the doors of the house of Yahweh and repaired them. So this kind of tells us that when Ahaz shut the doors, he had done a lot of damage. It's not just talking about repairing the doors. It's talking about repairing the insides, which we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then he went and he got the priests and the Levites and he put them back to work. He says, you all have a job to do. Now do it. Sanctify yourselves. Sanctify the house of Yahweh, Elohim of your fathers. And here's the part that gets you, or got me. Carry out the rubbish from the holy place. All right, now here's a cutout of the temple, of the worship portion of the temple. Here's the veil that would have been shut. So we're talking about this area right here. And this is called the holy place. This is the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place. So we're talking about this area right here. Doesn't say what was done back here. Doesn't say anything was done back here. We don't know. But it says here that he began to carry out the rubbish from the holy place. I just can't wrap my hands around that they destroyed this room. Okay. Now, back in Genesis, and I don't know, this is a segue without a segue. God said, let there be lights in the vault of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them indicate festivals, days, and years. This is the New Jerusalem Bible. The King James Version says seasons. So we're about to talk about some appointed times of God, appointed times that God established before creation. And we have a couple of examples of that. Number one, here's Genesis 1:14. I mean, bang, before the sun and the moon are even created, the appointed times are established. And then in Revelation, it talks about that the Christ was slain before the foundations of the world. The plan was in motion. And when was the Messiah slain? He was slain on a moed. He was slain on an appointed time of God. Okay, and then here's another similar translation in the Holman Christian Standard Bible, I believe. Then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. They will serve as signs for festivals and for days and years. And one of the things that we understand, or I think we understand, is that God's festivals are based on a lunar cycle. They're based on cycles of the moon. The calendar that we use today is based on the solar calendar. Now, I'm not an expert on any of that, but that's the way I understand it. We know that the new moon begins the month. That's when you can't see the moon at all. There's nothing there, maybe a teeny sliver. Then on the 15th, the moon's bright. It's a full moon. And then it wanes until it comes back to a sliver again. And the holy days are based on those times of the moon. Okay. Um, in Numbers 9, let's see, let me catch up. I think I've gotten ahead of myself as usual. I do that quite often. Um, okay. Two of the appointed times, I should have put Leviticus 23 in here because Moses wrote the words that God told him to write, and he said, "These are the appointed times of God." And he starts off and he names the Sabbath. The Sabbath is an appointed time of God, it's a moed. Then he goes in and he starts talking about each of the holy days. And one of the moeds that he mentions, and I know I knew this, but I think I had forgotten. But one of the moeds that he mentions is the wave offering. It's a moed. It's an appointed time, and we know that on that moed that the risen Christ presented himself to the Father. I don't have this in my notes, and I don't have it on my PowerPoints. So in Numbers, he talks about one of his moeds. He says Yahweh spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai. Okay, they're at the mountain in the first month of the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt. And he said, "Okay, look, I want all the children of Israel to keep the Passover at its appointed time." Now, why was this in the second year? Because the first year they were still in Egypt. And that's when we know about types and antitypes. That's when the type of Passover occurred, the killing of the firstborn of Egypt. So this is the second year, and they're at Mount Sinai. And he says, okay, from here on out, on the 14th day of this month at sundown, you shall keep it at its appointed time. You keep the moed. According to all its rites and ceremonies, you shall keep it. So Moses told the children of Israel that they should keep the Passover. And he told them when to keep the Passover. But we have a gracious God, don't we? He is just loaded with grace. And every once in a while, God's grace he'll exercise his grace. So what happened in this case? He says in verse 5, he says, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month at sundown, at the moed, at the appointed time. But, verse 6, there were certain men who were defiled by a human corpse. They touched a body. They buried someone, in effect. So they couldn't keep the Passover on that day. And they came to Moses and Aaron and said, hey, we want to keep the Passover, guys. We got a problem. We touched a dead body, so we can't observe the Passover this year. And in verse 7 said, we became defiled by a human corpse. But why can't we observe the Passover? We want to. We know God wants us to, but we can't do it. What are we going to do? And so Moses said, let me go talk to God and find out how we handle this situation. And in verse 9, it says that Yahweh spoke to Moses and said, okay, look, here is my grace. Here is an exception to my steadfast rule written in stone. On the 14th day of the first month, you're going to do this. He said, okay, now wait a minute. I'm going to be gracious. If any one of you or your family is unclean because of a corpse or is far away on a journey, he can still keep the Passover. Well, no, he can't because he's gone on the 14th day of the first month. But he goes on and he says, you can do it on the 14th day of the second month. And like I say, this is God's grace coming to uh, coming to pass. God made a provision for someone who, no fault of their own, missed the first Passover. And so he allowed for a makeup Passover a month later. I think this tells us a few things. One, it tells us how important it is to God that we observe not only the Passover, but God's holy days, and that we observe them when he says to observe them. And in this case, he made an exception for when these men or us can observe the Passover. And you can't. It's not because well I didn't feel like doing it. I forgot to go to the liquor store and get any wine, and Diane didn't make any unleavened bread, so oh man, I can't keep that's not what he's talking about. He's saying if this is not something you did on purpose, I'm going to give you an exception. And I'm sure some of you all have observed the Passover on the second, or conducted a Passover. I've done both. How many of you have either observed or conducted a Passover on the second Passover?
I have on the second.
I
Yeah,
have as well.
yeah. Okay. Yeah, I know you had Diane. Yeah. Diane and I have a friend. He's passed away now, who somehow he managed to miss the Passover one out every 4 or 5 years, and so I would conduct a second Passover for him. Um, so now I want you to take note here that nothing was said about the days of unleavened bread. And I've asked many people over the years, if you observe the second Passover, should you also observe the days of unleavened bread? And each time they gave me an answer, no. Well, that may be true, but I think we have an example here where, yes, they did, but I'll get into that in a minute. So we're talking about Hezekiah. I know y'all don't understand that because I've gone off talking about everything else, but I'm talking about Hezekiah and in his reign. In 2 Chronicles 29, it says that in the first year of Hezekiah's reign, in the first month, he reversed the evil that his father had done. He opened the doors of the house of Yahweh and repaired them. And I think when he says repaired them, he's not just talking about repairing the doors. He's talking about repairing the damage that was done to the holy place. It says he brought in the priests and the Levites and gathered them together. And he said, look, you guys have a job to do. You need to get sanctified. You need to sanctify the house of Yahweh and carry forth the filthiness out of the holy place. That still gets me every time I read that.
Can I interject?
Please do, Mark.
Okay, I think that the term filth is not a bad term. It's just that we don't understand all the ramifications of it. I think that it is, according to some things that I've read, that it is, if you think about it, filth equals uncleanness. Now, when we get to the term of uncleanness, we begin to understand maybe how that relates to some of the directions about the purification and uncleanness versus cleanness toward God. So part of this problem, as you've aptly said, is the previous kings were, for lack of a better term, kind of they were scumbags, and they had started worshiping false gods. They, in however way that they did it. And so this, if you think about some of the things that you know about purity toward God as related to the tabernacle system, etc., which was focused on worship of God, appropriate worship of God as it was described, and then think about what was going on prior to Hezekiah, where they had thumbed their nose at Yahweh and had other gods and didn't care. So this whole system of impurity toward God, and especially how it resulted in the temple there, was is maybe a more general way of thinking about it. Now, was there trash there? I don't know. Yeah, okay. So let's say there was trash. That's part of all the impurity things also. But the major affront to God could be summed up in saying that they had other gods before him, that they weren't loyal to him. And that fed down into everything that they did with regard to the temple. So if you think about it that way, it's actually even more, it's even more terrible. The most terrible thing that they could do was to reject him as their creator, redeemer, all things, and were disloyal to him. So I think Hezekiah is really saying, let's get our act together and turn back in loyalty to God in every way.
I'm glad you said that, because you're absolutely right. If you go on and read the rest of Second Chronicles 29 and 30, it does talk exactly about what you said. That's not the filth you mentioned is the filth that it talks about. I just saw the word filth and went off in the wrong direction. But you're exactly right. They were worshiping false gods in the holy place of God. Like I said, I don't know what happened with the most holy place. Doesn't say. I can't imagine. Uh, but the ark is gone at this point, I believe, is it not? Yeah, it has to be. It has to be gone. This is toward the end. I mean, Israel's already gone, and Judah's almost ready to go. So
I don't think that well, I don't know. I'm surmising. I don't think that took place until the temple was torn down by Nebuchadnezzar. So the
so
Israelites
it may
had,
have still been in there.
yeah,
Okay.
the 10 tribes had no control of Jerusalem or the temple. So I
Correct.
think that the temple, when the temple was torn down by Nebuchadnezzar's warring troops, that's probably when all of that took place.
Here's a fun
I
question.
think Jeremiah mentions uh, the Ark of the Covenant, and Jeremiah is in Hosea's time.
Okay. Michael?
I don't know, maybe Rod was trying to get to that point. Do we have a rough idea, or can we speculate when the Shekinah glory of God departed the temple before it was defiled and torn down by Nebuchadnezzar? Was it before? Was it during the uncleanness that was brought into there? Because I mean, we could assume, based on what Scripture says, that Yahweh Elohim is not going to have part with you know false gods or those things that are not of him. So would it be fair to speculate that once the Israelites began to incorporate the worship of other gods, bringing that quote unquote filth into the temple, that the presence, the Shekinah glory, departed out of the Holy of Holies at that point? Speculation, just an open question.
There may be a scripture that talks about that. I'm not familiar with it, but yeah, at some point it did.
I didn't mean to get too deep. I was just kind of curious. And of course, I would imagine his presence wasn't there when Nebuchadnezzar raised the temple down, because essentially his own people had abandoned him at that point. And so why would Yahweh Elohim stay in the presence of a people that have brought filth and defiled the sanctuary?
Yeah, we're not too far from that point. We're Hezekiah. We can talk about Josiah in a few minutes, but there were there were three kings after Josiah. All of them were terrible, and then the temple was destroyed in 586. I think I'm looking at the chart. I think it's 586, somewhere around in there, um, when the temple was destroyed.
I guess the reason I'm asking is, Scripture is consistent, and our Father says, Yahweh Elohim says He desires those that seek Him. And rather than mankind's idea that God just sits in a box and He stays in the Holy of Holies, or He stays in the church on Sundays, or He stays in this one spot, and then we come to Him when we're ready, and that God's always sitting there waiting. From what I understand reading Scripture is that He's desiring that those of us that seek Yahweh Elohim, we seek His face. If we draw near to Him, it's that point that He then comes and draws near to us as far as His presence goes. And I imagine, just speculating, that practice probably existed at the time of the temple itself also.
Okay. All right, and now back to what Mark said: carry forth the filthiness out of the holy place. I think he's exactly right that there were pagan uh, shrines or idols or whatever in the holy place, and so this is what he's talking about when Hezekiah carried the filthiness out of the holy place. That makes sense. For our fathers have trespassed, and they've done that which is evil in the eyes of Yahweh our Elohim, and have forsaken him. They've turned away their faces from the habitation of Yahweh and turned their back. This is the south. We or at least I did. I always had, until we really got into these studies, I had the impression that well, the South, were the good guys, and the North were the bad guys. Well, the North was the bad guys, no doubt, but the South was almost as bad. And if it weren't for some of the kings, a couple of the kings, Hosea and Josiah in particular, God would have carted them off to Babylon a long time before. But anyway,
Well,
verse
keep
7.
keep in mind keep in mind also that eventually, and I think maybe Rod knows this, eventually Jeremiah, I believe, ended up saying that Judah did worse than their terrible sister to the north.
Yeah, because they saw what had happened to them and didn't stop it. Isn't that kind of what it says, Mark?
Uh, well, I don't know. I can't answer that specifically. I would take it as meaning that their ultimate, that would probably be included, but their ultimate things that they did were just as bad or worse.
Yeah, yeah. What the point I'm making is that God says that what they did was worse because they saw what their sister had done. But anyway, we'll run across that one of these days, or somebody can look it up. Okay, verse 7, they've shut up the doors of the porch and put out the lamps and have not burned incense nor offered burnt offerings in the holy place to the God of Israel. They had totally stopped the worship of the one true God. And this is inside his temple. This is in the holy place. So thanks to the acts of Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah, the temple was a mess. It had probably pagan idols and things like what Mark was talking about. And then the Levites were not ceremonially clean in order to conduct the Passover service, nor was the temple. Can you imagine the words of, well, anyway, I'll skip that. So I've got another, I think, a picture. Yeah. Here's a little, it's not as clear, but it's bigger. This is the area right here where I believe it says that Ahaz broke up these pieces. But at any rate, inside this room right here were probably pagan idols and things like that. What Mark was talking about. So under the command of Hezekiah, the priests and the Levites began to sanctify themselves in order to be ready to minister in the temple. Verse 11, my sons, he's talking to the Levites, do not be negligent now, for Yahweh has chosen you, Levites, priests, to stand before him, to serve him, and that you should minister to him and burn incense. And they gathered their brethren and they sanctified themselves. This is talking about the Levites and the descendants of Aaron. And they went according to the commandment of the king at the words of Yahweh to cleanse the house of Yahweh. Then the priests went into the inner part of the house of Yahweh to cleanse it, to take out these idols and so on, and brought out all the debris that they found in the temple of Yahweh to the court of the house. And they took it and carried it to the brook Kidron. And I didn't carry on, but they burned it, they smashed it, they turned it into ash. You can find that reading farther in chapter 29. So in verse 17, it says, they began to sanctify on the first day of the month. Okay, this is only 14 days before they're supposed to observe the statutory time of the Passover. It says that on the 8th day of the month, they came to the vestibule of Yahweh, and then they sanctified the house in 8 days, but they didn't finish till the 16th day of the first month. Well, guess what? Passover is the 14th day of the first month. So they got off to a late start. They didn't get it finished in time, and they got it cleansed and sanctified 2 days after the statutory time of the Passover. So that if you read on in chapter 27, you're going to see, you're not going to believe how many sacrifices that the Levites and the priests made during this period. And it says that there were so many done that there weren't enough priests to conduct them. They had to ask some of the Levites, who are not descendants of Aaron. If you remember, that's the difference between a priest and a Levite. So they needed help. So the Levites came in and did some of the work of the priests. Then in verse 36, it says, then Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced that God had prepared the people, since the events took place so suddenly. I mean, this was pretty sudden. Hezekiah learned what needed to be done. He talked to the priests and the Levites. They learned what needed to be done, which tells us that these guys had certainly not been doing it. They didn't know what they were supposed to do, but they learned what they were supposed to do, but they couldn't get it done in time. So now, Hezekiah did something here that was almost unheard of in those days. And now remember, this is just a short time before the northern tribes were taken into captivity, something like 50 years. And Hosea was in his last days as king of Israel. If you look at the chart, which I thought I had in here, but I don't have it in here, sorry. Hezekiah's reign started about halfway through Hosea's reign, which he was the last of the kings. And in verse 30, it says that Hezekiah did something very different. He sent to all Israel and Judah, and this is apparently after Israel has been taken into captivity. Not necessarily, but it seems like it to me anyway. He sent a letter to Ephraim and Manasseh and to all Israel, inviting them to come back to Jerusalem. Come back and worship Yahweh. Come back and observe the Passover on the 14th day, in this case of the second month. But they didn't. A few of them did. And maybe, and I think I'm going to correct myself. I think this is just a little before they were taken into captivity. Had they accepted this invitation and had they come back to Jerusalem and worshiped on the Passover, maybe God would have given the northern tribes a little more time. So the runners passed from city to city through the country of Ephraim. They've gone up into the north, and they've gone through the country of Ephraim and Manasseh and as far as Zebulun. But guess what? The Israelites laughed at them and they mocked them. But then some of the people from Asher and some from Manasseh and Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. But because this consecration of the temple and the priest was so late, it was decided to observe the festival in the second month, as was prescribed in Numbers, which I read earlier, that there was an exception. If you can't observe it on the 14th day of the first month, God's grace will allow you to observe it on the 14th day of the second month. So in verse 2 here it says, for the king and his leaders, this is Hezekiah, and all the assembly in Jerusalem had agreed, hey, we missed the first month, so we're going to keep it in the second month. For they could not keep it at the regular time because a sufficient number of priests had not consecrated themselves, nor had the people gathered together at Jerusalem. They were still all scattered all over the place. And the matter pleased the king and the assembly. It pleased the king that they would observe the Passover on the 14th day of the second month, because they knew what it said in Numbers, that God's grace had allowed this. So verse 5, they resolved to make a proclamation throughout all Israel, all the way from Beersheba to Dan. If you remember, Beersheba is at the bottom part of the north, and Dan's at the top part of the north, where the calves were put by Jeroboam, that they should come to keep the Passover to Yahweh, Elohim of Israel, at Jerusalem, since they had not done it for a long time in the prescribed manner. They had not kept it either on the first month or the second month for a long time. But in verse 15 it says, then they slaughtered the Passover lambs on the 14th day of the second month. And the priests and the Levites were ashamed, and they sanctified themselves and brought the burnt offerings to the house of Yahweh. Not sure why they were ashamed. It wasn't really their fault. But, I guess they were sorry that They didn't know better. They hadn't, done the work that needed to be done, a month before the first month or whatever. But it says they were ashamed, but they sanctified themselves and they brought the burnt offerings to the house of Yahweh. And in verse 21, it says, so the children of Israel who were present at Jerusalem did something different. This is not what God said in Numbers. It says they kept the feast of unleavened bread 7 days with great gladness. And the Levites and the priests praised Yahweh day by day for those 7 days, singing to Yahweh, accompanied by loud instruments. Now, this is something that apparently they took on themselves. Now, I have no doubt that there were a lot of prayers that went up and that they knew that it was okay with God, but this is different from what was done with those 4 guys back in Numbers, where God said, okay, well, if you've touched a dead body, you can keep the Passover on the 14th day of the second month. Now, let me throw a little caveat in here. Sometimes the term Passover means Passover and days of unleavened bread. So I'm separating it here, but this may not have been a separation. This may have been them saying, we're keeping the Passover, meaning on the 14th and then through the 21st. I don't know. It doesn't tell us. But it seems to be something different. And it seems to be that God approved the keeping of the days of unleavened bread in the second month, beginning on the 15th day. Anybody see any problem with that, or what was going on here? Because
Well,
I'm out.
I
Go
don't
ahead.
see any problem with it. I think that this is reflective of what the prophets later say in the I didn't have time to look the scripture up, but my paraphrase is that has the Lord pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices as compared to justice and mercy and faith. And it's clear that having those kind of orientations and the loyalty to God is more important, or was stated is more important by this example of being loyal to God than it was given the circumstances and doing it exactly on the right day.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And then, I can't help but think of, well, what if we were to do this today? Well, number one, we don't observe the 7 days of unleavened bread in together like they did back then. But what if it was the feast? What if we decided to keep the feast for another 7 days? And that's opening a can of worms. I don't want to get into all of that, but if we did it in the right spirit, like these people did, like what Mark was saying, that God wants our hearts to be right. Maybe God would bless it. But anyway, sorry, I shouldn't have even brought that up. Okay.
No,
Um,
I'm glad you brought it up. I love the idea of thinking about let's continue it on another week. How often are we at the feast kind of bummed out that it all has to come to an end, what we're picturing? And like you mentioned, if God's judging the heart and we're not circumventing the intention of his holy days by combining, traditions that are not from him. I mean, they were keeping the feasts. They weren't trying to substitute the feasts or add to the feasts of the Lord. They were simply extending them. And I think that's the balance that we have to have. Because, churchianity would say, well, God judges the heart so we could, celebrate, Christ's birthday and things of that nature, which is different. That's not celebrating the law of God or the holy moeds of God. They were simply extending those dates or celebrating them in a season where they couldn't do it at the appointed time. And so the matter of the heart, I think, is always very important to God, and it's the right heart for the right purpose and the right reason to keep in mind.
yeah, yeah, well, I'm stammering and stuttering, as my wife would say. Uh, but yeah, I think if we, whatever we do, if we do it with the right heart and the right attitude, I think God's going to bless it. Now, that doesn't mean changing the Sabbath day, and I'm not going there. I'm just saying, uh, okay, let me give you this example. And Diane's going to love this example. Let's say that I tell Diane, hey, look, we need to observe the Day of Atonement 2 days and not one. Bad example, wasn't it, Diane? Um,
Yes, it was.
yeah, yeah. There are people, and all of you probably know someone who won't eat anything from noon on before sundown that begins the Day of Atonement, and won't eat anything, till midnight after it's over because they want to make sure their stomachs are empty and all. Personally, I don't think that's the right kind of an attitude. And I don't think that's the attitude that these people had. These people were celebrating. They were happy. It says they kept the feast 7 days with great gladness here. And the Levites and the priests praised Yahweh day by day, singing to the Lord. Now, but in this case, and I'm getting my two times mixed up. In this case, they only kept it for 7 days, but boy, it was a big 7 days when they kept it. But they kept it in the second month, beginning on the 14th day of the month, which is not what God had given grace for those guys that had touched the dead body, but God approved of it. He accepted their celebration of the days of unleavened bread. Okay. Except I think I just got it mixed up. This is when they did it for 2 weeks. Then the whole assembly agreed to keep the feast another 7 days. And they kept it another 7 days with gladness. It was Josiah who only did it for 7 days. Sorry. So they kept the days of unleavened bread beginning in the second month. And then they kept it for 14 days. And they kept it with gladness, with celebration, with love for God. And this was not a violation of God's command. In Revelation, the very last thing, it says, he who adds to or takes away from the words of this book. That's not what these people were doing. They were lovingly celebrating God's Moed. And it very clearly says it here in verse 12. It says, also the hand of God was on Judah to give them singleness of heart to obey the command of the king. At the word of Yahweh, he fully approved of what they were doing. It was such a joyous occasion that the people celebrated, and they worshiped another 7 days with God's blessing. Verse 26 says, so there was great joy in Jerusalem, for since the time of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, there had been nothing like this in Jerusalem. God blessed this celebration. He blessed the first week and he blessed the second week, even though there was nothing written in the law that authorized the observation of the days of unleavened bread for 2 weeks. So we had a term of a terrible scumbag, as Mark said a while ago. That's one of my favorite terms. The father of Hezekiah. Then we had good King Hezekiah. Then we had his scumbag son, Manasseh. I mean, horrible king, great king, horrible king. Bang. Here's Manasseh. Manasseh was 12 years old. Apparently, he was 12 uh, when Hezekiah died, and we may come back and talk about, well, we probably will, in 2 Kings chapter 20, about when Hezekiah asked for extra time. God gave him 15 years, but then it turned out that then Hezekiah made a mistake. We'll come back to that. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hephzibah. And I know I've talked about two good mothers. I'm not sure I would be able to say that about this one. Maybe she tried. But anyway, verse 2, he did evil in the sight of Yahweh according to the abominations of the nations whom Yahweh had cast out before the children of Israel. The very things that the people of Canaan were doing when Israel crossed the Jordan, and God said, get rid of them, kill them, don't do what they did, don't marry into their families, don't set up their idols, don't do any of that stuff. But Manasseh did that very thing. And he rebuilt the high places which Hezekiah, his father, had destroyed. That was some of the part that I didn't go through. Hezekiah destroyed the high places that his dad had built, and then his son went in and built them back. And he raised up altars for Baal and made a wooden image, as Ahab, the king of Israel, had done. And he worshiped all the hosts of heaven and served them. It does not take people, Israel in this case, Judah in this case, long to turn on a dime. It's only about 50 years after. Oh wait, okay, I've jumped the gun here. Okay, so now 50 years after Manasseh, we finally get another good king. And what a mess it was during that 50 years. So after 50 years, the temple is back in the shape that it was when Hezekiah began his reign, when there were idols and evil things in the holy place. But we've got another good king that comes along, and he's the last good king that Judah had. But he began his reign as a child. And this is where I'm saying I can't help but think his mother had a very important role in raising him the right way. It says Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 31 years. So he reigned till he was 39 years old. And his mother's name was Jedida, the daughter of, well, anyway. And he did what was right in the sight of Yahweh, and he walked in all the ways of his father David, and he didn't turn aside to the right hand or the left. So Josiah began his work to reestablish worship of God when he was only 16 years old. He became king when he was 8, and it says in the 8th year of his reign, so he's 16, he began to seek Yahweh of his father. But his father David, excuse me. Don't stop there. It wasn't his father. He began to seek the God of his father David. And in the 12th year, okay, so he started reigning when he was 8. When he was 16, he began to worship God and to seek God and to learn what God wanted. And 4 years later, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of the high places. He destroyed the high places. He destroyed the wooden images, the carved images, and the molded images. He got rid of the idols. Verse 4, they broke down the altars of the Baals in his presence, and the incense altars which were above them he cut down. The wooden images, the carved images, the molded images, he broke them in pieces. And this is the same thing that Hezekiah had done. And he made dust of them, and he scattered it on the graves of those who had sacrificed to them. He took this, how would I put it, the cremation, if you will, of these idols, and he scattered on the dust of the evil men and women who had sacrificed to him. Now, Israel's gone at this point. They've been taken into captivity. They're gone. So guess what he does? He goes up to the north, and he goes to Manasseh and Ephraim and Simeon, and he goes as far as Naphtali and all around with axes, and he cut down these totem poles, if you will, and he destroyed them, and he burned them, and he spread the ashes. And so 10 years later, after in the 18th year of his reign, so he's 26, when he had purged the land and the temple, he sent, now here's some good men that he surrounded himself with. Shaphan, the son of Azaliah, and I can't pronounce Messiah, the governor of the city, and Joah, the son of Joaz, the recorder. And he sent them to repair the house of Yahweh, his Elohim. Now, I'm intrigued by this next scripture because it's only been about 50 years since Hezekiah reestablished Passover, and I assume the other holy days and other parts of God's law. And in 50 years, the people of Judah had already lost it. Manasseh had gone a long way to have, a horrible kingship, and then Ammon after him. They were terrible kings. And so in 50 years, they're no longer worshiping the one true God. How did the Judeans lose it in that short of a time? Well, where's this country gone in the last 50 years? Michael, I may have just gotten us kicked off. How did the Judeans lose it in that short of a time? Verse 14. It says now, okay, so Josiah has been raising money to repair the damage that was done to the city of Jerusalem, the temple, and so on. It says now when they brought out the money that was brought into the house of Yahweh, Hezekiah the priest found the book of the law. This is what throws me. Where had it been? Well, it had been in the temple. Why hadn't anybody found it? Well, I guess they hadn't been in there in 50 years. It astounds me that after Hezekiah, 50 years later, they don't even know where the Bible is. Or this particular book. Some people say it was the book of Deuteronomy, I believe. But, it doesn't make any difference. They don't know it's in there. They don't know where it is. They hadn't been in the temple. It was a mess. It had all this pagan stuff in it. But Hezekiah, the priest, when they were in there cleaning out all of the pagan stuff that Mark was talking about earlier, he found the book of the law. And so they just ignored it, right? No, they didn't ignore it. they took it out and they read it, and they were amazed that there were things that they hadn't been doing. There were things that God commanded that they had not been doing. And Josiah, being a good king and being a follower of Yahweh, he said in verse 2, Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the scribe, I jumped ahead. I found the book of the law in the house of Yahweh. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it too. And Shaphan, who was the scribe, came to the king and said, "You're not going to believe this. Look what we have found." He said, "Your servants have gathered the money that was found in the house, and they've delivered it to the hand of them that do the work." And here's what's interesting. Here's honesty. And they gave it to the people that had oversight over the house of Yahweh. They didn't take it for themselves. They didn't take it for their families. They gave it to the ones doing the work. And Shaphan the scribe showed the book to the king and said, "Hey, the high priest he gave me this book, and let me read it to you." And so Shaphan read to the king, and it came to pass when the king heard the words of the book of the law that he rent his clothes. He realized what they had not been doing, and he had not known this. And so he's pretty upset. He's probably upset with himself, in addition to upset with the other leaders of Judah up to this point. And so then the king sent, and he got all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem, and he brought in the priests, and he brought in the prophets, and all the people, great, small, and great, and he read in their ears all the words of the book of the covenant, which was found in the house of Yahweh. And the king stood by a pillar and made a covenant. He made an agreement before Yahweh to walk after Yahweh, to keep his commandments, to keep his testimonies and his statutes with all their heart and all their soul. And you can read in this that the people agreed with this covenant also, to perform the words of this covenant that were written in this book. And all the people stood to the covenant. And so the king began cleansing the temple of Yahweh. Again, what I think what Mark was saying was right. The pagan things that were in there. And you can read all about this in the 23rd chapter of 2 Kings. And I'm only going to hit a couple of high points today. 2 Kings 23:4. The king commanded Hilkiah the high priest and the priests of the second order and the keepers of the order to take all of that stuff out of the temple, all the vessels. This is exactly what Mark was talking about. All the vessels that were made for Baal and for the grove and for all the hosts of heaven, and he burned them outside of Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, and he carried the ashes of them to Bethel. If you remember, Bethel was one of the main places where the idols were worshipped in the north. And in verse 16, it says, and as Josiah turned, he saw something interesting. And he saw the tombs that were on the mountain. And he went and he took the bones out of those tombs and he burned them on the altar, because he knew they were the people who had worshipped Baal and the other false gods, and they defiled it according to the word of Yahweh, which the man of God proclaimed, who proclaimed these words. And then here's what he said. He said, "What gravestone is this that I see? What is it? What is this one? Wait a minute. This one's a little different. This one looks special." And so the men of the city said, okay, it is special. It's the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and proclaimed these things which you've done against the altar of Bethel. You may remember we studied this back probably a year ago, and it was a prophecy. And so the king said, let him alone. Let no one move his bones. So they let his bones alone with the bones of the prophet who came from Samaria. And here's that prophecy. Here's what we read. Goodness gracious, it must have been close to a year ago in 1 Kings 13. Behold, a man of God, we're not told who, went from Judah to Bethel by the word of Yahweh. And Jeroboam, this is when Jeroboam had just taken over as king of the north, and he had set up these golden calves to worship in Bethel and Dan. And Jeroboam stood by the altar to burn incense. And this man of God cried out against the altar by the word of Yahweh and said, and you may remember that, oh, altar, altar, thus says Yahweh, behold, a child, Josiah by name, shall be born to the house of David, and on you, altar, he shall sacrifice the priests of the high places. He's going to kill them. He's going to burn them on that altar. Who burn incenses on you, and men's bones shall be burned on you. And you know, we read about that a long time ago. Okay, so Josiah has found this out. He's been told about the book of the law. The men who serve him, the priest, the high priest who serves in the place of God, you know, who serves for God, found out about what they should do. And they got it done in time. It says, now Josiah kept a Passover to Yahweh in Jerusalem. And they slaughtered the Passover lambs when? On the 14th day of the first month. They, unlike Hezekiah, found out what they were supposed to do in time to get it done to celebrate the Passover on the 14th day. Now, either one was okay with God. His grace covered both of them. And in Chronicles chapter 35, it says, and the children of Israel who were present kept the Passover at that time, and they kept the feast of unleavened bread for 7 days. Okay, so in this case, they didn't keep it for 2 weeks. They kept it for 7 days. But, verse 18, there had been no Passover, and when we're talking about Passover here, we're talking about the combination of the Passover and the days of unleavened bread. There had been no Passover kept in Israel like that since the days of Samuel the prophet, and none of the kings of Israel had kept such a Passover as Josiah kept, with the priests and the Levites, all Judah and Israel who were present, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. In the 18th year of the reign of Josiah, so what is he, 26, this Passover was kept. It was the greatest Passover that had been celebrated for about 400 years. No Passover kept like this since the days of Samuel. Now, I was doing a reading, a little reading, and the writer said that they had not kept Passover for 400 years, and I'm like, what? Where in the world do you get that? Hezekiah kept it 50 years earlier. You know, don't tell me they hadn't kept it for 400 years. They hadn't kept it like this, like what Michael was talking about, from pure from the heart, that it was one of the greatest Passovers to ever be celebrated.
Since the days of Samuel, can you think
Yeah,
of when Samuel kept it? Nothing stands out in my mind,
nope, nope.
but he must have, I guess.
But they did keep it. It just says they didn't keep it like that. There wasn't a celebration as great since the days of Samuel. Uh, but we know 50 years earlier Hezekiah kept the Passover. So whoever wrote that they hadn't kept it for 400 years, I don't know, missed the boat somehow, because it seems to me that what he's talking about is how great a celebration it was, not since the days of Samuel the prophet. Verse 18 again, there had been no Passover kept in Israel like that since the days of Samuel. Okay. Now, here's a couple of points that, as I told you at the beginning, I thought I was going to come up with these great points, and I got through going through all of this, and I was really glad I went through it, but I don't know if you all liked it as much as I did, but I really enjoyed going through these verses. But God established His moeds, or His appointed times, at their appointed times. Now, let me ask you a question. Did the Passover become an appointed time when the Israelites observed it in Egypt, or was it already an appointed time? To me, it's very clear. It was already an appointed time. It was an appointed time from the very beginning, that God established His appointed times from the beginning. Genesis 1:14, God established His appointed times. This is before man was created. There were appointed times that were set up. So it's not up to us to make determinations when God's appointed times are. God has written those appointed times in the scriptures.
Hey, can I, well, to
Yes,
bolster your point, Skip, uh, you quoted Genesis earlier, that the first holy day that is established in Deuteronomy 23 is is the Sabbath day. And we know from Genesis that the Sabbath was it was it was an appointed time. So I guess, why couldn't we extrapolate from that the rest of these days, which are listed in Deuteronomy 23, why wouldn't they also have been verbally handed down as appointed times from the time of Adam?
absolutely. There are little bits and pieces that we read, prior to Israel being in Egypt, where unleavened bread was given to the angels, if you will, the messengers of God. The little tidbits that we run into every once in a while, that indicate, that convince me anyway, that these days had been observed. But even if they hadn't, they were established before the creation. If the Messiah was to be killed before the world began, and we know that He was killed on a moed, on one of God's appointed times, it's pretty clear to me anyway that the moeds, or the appointed times, were established when God and His Son sat down. I say sat down, that's a human term, and developed this great plan that's going to culminate one of these days in the return of Christ, which we're getting pretty close to the celebration of a day that symbolizes that. Anyway, so, well, thanks, Michael. You're exactly right.
Yeah, I gotta
Uh,
correct myself, and actually, Erica didn't correct me. I just caught myself. I said Deuteronomy 23. It should be Leviticus
yeah,
23.
Leviticus 23. Yeah,
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 I just realized my error after I had spoken it. Again, the brain no longer connects to the mouth nerves. I make many mistakes. Of course, I usually walk around with my foot in my mouth most of the time, as most of you know. But hey, getting old's no fun.
yeah. Well, I've only made about 5 mistakes so far today, so you're allowed one. Don't make another one.
I, I like to read verse 25, saying about Josiah.
Okay.
Before him, there was no king like him. Before him, there was no king like him who turned to the Lord with all his heart and all his soul and with all his might, according to the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. So that's why I would say Josiah was the greatest king ever.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue with that, but the same thing is sort of said about Hezekiah. They were both great kings, but apparently there was maybe a little bit of difference in some of the things that they did. So yeah, I agree with you, Rod. But it said kind of the same thing about Hezekiah.
I remember what Ron Dart said about Hezekiah when they said, "You'll live 15 more years, but your children will be subject to all these terrible things." How in the world could he do that? Anyone remember him saying that?
Yes, that's it, and that's exactly what happened when uh, when Hezekiah was on his deathbed and he prayed, and then Isaiah came back to him, which I thought was kind of interesting because Isaiah and Hezekiah were buddies apparently. And Isaiah came back. Isaiah barely got out the door before God told him, hey, Hezekiah's been praying. I'm going to give him some more time. Go back and tell him he gets 15 more years. But what and we'll get into this the probably after the holy days. But uh, what happened with Hezekiah was that his ego got him in trouble. But we'll get into that later. But yeah, you're right. He told I think he told Hezekiah, you're not going to have to go through it, but yeah, your kids will, and that's what
He was
happened.
overjoyed. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, thanks. We'll get into that a little bit in more detail. I think in a few weeks. I don't know when the next time we'll get into it. We may have do we have a Sabbath in between trumpets and atonement? We do, don't we? I think we do.
Yes,
Anyway,
it's the 23rd.
okay.
Is
Well, we
that
may get into it then, unless someone else wants to speak. Anyway, but you guys have been giving me a lot of time off lately, and I do appreciate it. And by the way, does everybody here know I'll be more than happy to step aside anytime that anybody wants to do 1 or 50 of these Bible studies. I enjoy what I learn from them, but I don't have to do them. So you know, anybody is more than welcome to jump in anytime they want to. So anyway, okay. So that was point one. You know, it's not up to us to determine when appointed times are. God has already put them. He put them down in the uh, in Deuteronomy, as Michael says. No, I'm kidding. In Leviticus 23, and those are God's appointed time. Now, are those God's only appointed times? There's some prophetical scriptures that kind of indicate there may be more later on that will be symbolic of other things, but that's a whole nother issue. But we can't do what Jeroboam did. We can't say, okay, let's move the feast a month, without God's authority. he did allow them to move Passover a month for some people, but not for everybody. But anyway, of course, there are calendar differences. Uh, I have no idea how many different calendars are used in determining when holy days are. Uh, and personally, I think God probably honors everybody's honest attempt to understand when those days begin. I do believe that. What I don't believe is that, some of the people believe that the Sabbath restarts every month or something like that. I'm not sure exactly what, the people that believe that. So the Sabbath can be a Tuesday or a Thursday or a Monday or whatever. And then the other thing that I have a hard time uh, believing or understanding is that the Sabbath begins at sunrise and ends at sunset. I've got a friend that believes that. You all may know some people that believe that. But anyway, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about,
Well, since you brought it up, uh,
yes.
and we are talking about matters of the heart. I just not to beat our drum, but it is something I think that you talk about God honoring. Some of us come from a church culture that if you were not a carbon copy cookie cutter of everything else that came down from on high, from headquarters or councils of men or home office or whatever, that you weren't part of the church and you were somehow engaged in apostasy. At the feast at Kentucky Lake at the Moors, we know of three separate different groups that are all coming together to keep the feast on the calculated calendar, which is the one that we use. But they all observe a completely different calendar, and their high days are off a day or two, sometimes 3 or 4 days off from ours. But we're all coming together to observe and celebrate the feast, and so it's a non-issue, and we don't allow that an agenda of pushing calendar dates upon one another in order to cause offense. And when you have that kind of welcoming, we're all here to keep the feast. This group follows the cited, and some groups they calculate it differently, and we do this calculated. And so why can't we be together? We're all keeping the Feast of Tabernacles, and if you have that right kind of attitude and the right kind of heart to celebrate before Yahweh Elohim, then everybody benefits. There's a unity that grows when you are willing to accommodate one another. And so I just wanted to accentuate the point that you brought up, Skip. And so that's a good thing.
And I could not agree with you more. Michael, you and I were probably part of the ones who thought everybody was an idiot that didn't observe on the same days that we did. And
Oh yes.
now to me, it's not important. As long as you're doing what you believe God is leading you to do, I'm fine with that. As long as you believe in Christ, that's kind of my, you have to believe in God and you have to believe in Christ. Other than that, we can have so many differences as long as we're not jerks about it. And it's uplifting for me to know, and I do know because you and I've talked about this, to know that your group has figured out a way to come together without having to get into fights about who's right and who's wrong. So
Yeah,
bless you.
basically, uh, the feast in Kentucky Lake is this fellowship, Bible Home Fellowship, in the meat world during the feast. It works. So kudos to following the lead of the Spirit to establish and get this going, Skip, because you inspired a lot of people, and it works.
Yep, I think it does. All right, the second point, I told you I thought I was going to come up with these great points, and I didn't. But there are a couple of points that I wanted to make. The first was that God sets his appointed times. Second is that we at least know of one time when God made an exception. And I call this grace, and I'm sure you all would too, that he had the grace to allow these men to still observe the Passover, which was very, very important to them. They were very upset that they couldn't observe the Passover with their brethren. And God said, okay, you can do it on the 14th day of the second month. That's grace. And we don't know of any other exceptions that God has made that way. We do know that God made an exception and let the people of Judah celebrate the days of unleavened bread for 2 weeks instead of one. We know that. So God can make accommodations to people, and it's a part of his grace. I remember it's been 2 or 3 years ago, Mark, you may remember, you gave a wonderful sermon or presentation on God's grace, and it's stuck in my mind, and I'm sure other people,
It's
for
been a lot longer than 2 or 3 years.
well, it's a wonder that I can remember it then. But it was really, really good, and it has really stuck in my mind, and it's made me allowed me to understand God's grace a whole lot better. So again, thank you for that message. But yeah, you're right. I guess it was. We've been together a long time, folks, a long time, and it's been great. So God sometimes can make an adjustment. I mean, who's gonna question God? I'm certainly not going to, and I doubt if anybody here is going to, but he makes adjustments to accommodate people. Here's one example when he did it with the Passover. And one more thing that I wanted to do, and you all may want to throw rocks at me here, but I want to criticize the Bible. I want to criticize the men who put together the Bible because they didn't do a very good job of putting the books in in a chronological order. And I've got one glaring example of that. Now, I'm being a little facetious in criticizing these men, but if you look at your Bible and the books in the Bible, you will find I don't know if you all can see this or not, but in the Old Testament, it ends. The last several books are Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, and Zechariah and Malachi, right? And that's the Bible, and that's the order that we're used to. Well, guess what? Some of that's not even close. Here is a copy of the order of the books in the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible. And I want to concentrate on the last 3 books over here. Daniel, and then Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Okay? That's the order of the Jewish Bible. All right, now I want to show you all. Some of you may have a copy of the chart that Mark gave us. If I can find it, here we go. Oh, bad copy. Here we go. This is a good copy. Okay, I want you to look here. Zedekiah was the last king of Israel. The temple was destroyed, 70 years of captivity, and then we didn't have any more kings in Judah. What we had were governors. Zerubbabel, and then it just says other governors, and then Nehemiah, and then I don't really know what Neanbab is. I guess that may be a name. And then Nehemiah again. But notice it says temple finished, and it has Ezra's name right there. These are the last guys. And if you read their books, which we'll get to eventually, we'll find that these should have been the last book in our Bible, but that's not the way that the men that put our Bible together, if you will. Now, all the books are correct. I don't have a problem with that. It's just that it seems to me that they missed it a little bit. When Ezra and Nehemiah were the last two guys to be governors of Judah. So anyway, so now I've thrown out my heretical statement for the day.
It's not heretical. I guess I'm of the mindset that if Yahweh Elohim wanted the scriptures to be placed in chronological order so that those of us who believe on the word by the testimony of those that Christ called to be his disciples, then he would have made it so. And that he didn't. That's not how it was done. And I suppose maybe this falls into the here a little, there a little, precept, line upon line, precept upon precept, that there's some things that are sealed, that are covered, and maybe that's one of the ways in which that sealing took place, that there are things that are not yet to be revealed or unsealed until the time of the end. I mean, and that's, maybe that's why we're coming into a better understanding of things in this age than those that came before us. So I trust Yahweh. This is his word. And I guess I'm of the mind that if he wanted it in chronological order to read like a novel, then he would have inspired through the Spirit those that meticulously wrote down the scriptures to put them in the order he wanted them, and that was not done. So Romans 8:28. That's how I look at it.
Yep, I don't have a problem with that at all. The Jews saw it a different way, but the important thing is that all the books that God wanted in there, I believe, are in there. So I agree with you, Michael. Okay, that's it for me. I wasn't able to make any great points. I apologize. This was just a kind of a standard Bible study, but I wanted to talk about these two kings and what they did and what great men they were. So, thoughts, comments, corrections?
Well, those two kings might have been good, but I tell you what, a lot of similarities in the people. It's very interesting how quickly we forget the lessons of history. And here you have a southern nation whose brothers in the north were literally completely and utterly destroyed and taken into captivity. And what, less than 200 years later or 150 years later, they actually end up doing worse than their northern brothers did. And that's just one of those things you just shake your head at. Of course, we're looking in hindsight at things. But I mean, you look even today, you look at the absolute ignorance of history, even among our people today, that don't even remember the lessons of days gone past, and we're repeating very similar mistakes today that are not even 80 years, 85, 90, not even a century old. And we're making the same dumb, stupid mistakes because we no longer teach and we don't remember history, and we no longer consider the warnings that Yahweh Elohim gave us. We don't consider the warnings our founding fathers wrote down and warned us. Don't do these things. You're going to end up here. And so I guess looking at current events, we kind of see how it happens. But we haven't been in a situation where we could see our brothers being completely annihilated and destroyed for what they did, and then we turn around and actually do worse. So there's that aspect of it. Just an interesting observation as you go through this study.
Yeah, we certainly have not learned from our mistakes. That's for sure, and we made a lot of them. I'm talking about our country. But I better shut off the recording before Michael and I get us kicked off.
You know, that's